The sound of metal against bone echoes through the basement of a modest Victorian home in Manchester, England. It is 3 o'clock in the morning on November 15th, 1923, and Eleanor Hartwell methodically works her way through what was once her husband of 27 years. The butcher's cleaver rises and falls with practiced precision, each strike calculated to separate joint from joint, flesh from bone. By dawn, what had been Thomas Hartwell would be reduced to 14 carefully wrapped parcels, each one destined for a different location across the industrial city. This is not a story of sudden rage or temporary madness. This is the tale of a woman who planned her husband's death with the same meticulous attention to detail she had once applied to organizing church fundraisers and managing the household accounts. A woman whose love had curdled into something far more dangerous than hate. A woman who would shock Victorian England with the cold calculation of her crime and the disturbing intimacy of her method. Eleanor Hartwell was born Eleanor Margaret Thorne in 1869, the daughter of a respectable clockmaker in the Didsbury district of Manchester. Her childhood was unremarkable by the standards of the emerging middle class. Regular attendance at St. James Church, piano lessons on Wednesday afternoons, and a proper education at Miss Hamilton's Academy for Young Ladies. She learned to read French, to embroider, to manage a household, and most importantly, to present herself as the ideal Victorian woman, demure, dutiful, and devoted to the men in her life. At 19, she caught the eye of Thomas Hartwell, a junior clerk at Cromwell and Associates, a firm that managed the financial affairs of Manchester's growing textile industry. Thomas was 7 years her senior, possessed of a steady income and solid prospects for advancement. More crucially, he met with the approval of Eleanor's father, who saw in the young man a suitable match for his daughter. Their courtship followed the prescribed patterns of Victorian propriety: chaperoned walks in Alexandra Park, carefully supervised visits in the Thorne family parlour, and a modest engagement announcement in the Manchester Guardian. Thomas presented Eleanor with a simple gold band set with a small garnet, and she accepted with what observers described as quiet satisfaction rather than passionate joy. They married on June 12, 1890, in a ceremony attended by both families and a selection of Thomas's colleagues from Cromwell and Associates. The newlyweds established themselves in a narrow 3-story house on Pemberton Street, a respectable address that reflected Thomas's growing success in the financial world. Eleanor threw herself into the role of wife with characteristic thoroughness, maintaining an immaculate home, preparing elaborate meals, and presenting herself as the perfect complement to her husband's professional ambitions. For the first 5 years of their marriage, the Hartwells appeared to embody domestic harmony. Thomas advanced steadily within the firm, eventually becoming a senior clerk with responsibility for several major accounts. Eleanor established herself as an active member of St. Mark's congregation, organizing charity drives and supervising the preparation of meals for the parish poor. Neighbors would later describe her as a model wife, always properly dressed, unfailingly polite, and devoted to her husband's comfort. But those same neighbors would also recall, with the hindsight that only tragedy brings, certain peculiarities in Eleanor's behavior. Her obsession with routine, for instance. Every morning at precisely 7 o'clock, she would appear at the front window to wave goodbye to Thomas as he departed for work. Every evening at 6:15, she would be waiting at that same window for his return. Deviation from this schedule, even by a few minutes, would leave her visibly agitated. There was also her remarkable memory for detail. Eleanor could recall with perfect accuracy what Thomas had worn on any given day, what he had eaten for breakfast, which route he had taken to work. She maintained detailed journals documenting their daily activities, their conversations, their intimate relations. What had initially seemed like the conscientiousness of a devoted wife gradually revealed itself as something more intensive, more consuming. The first crack in their marital facade appeared in 1895, when Eleanor suffered what the family physician delicately termed a nervous episode. For 3 weeks, she refused to leave her bedroom, claiming that something terrible would happen to Thomas if she was not there to watch over him. She accused the housemaid of trying to poison his food, dismissed the gardener for allegedly spying on their home, and began checking and rechecking the locks on all doors and windows multiple times each night. Thomas, embarrassed by his wife's behavior and concerned about its potential impact on his professional reputation, arranged for Eleanor to spend a month with her sister in the countryside. The rest and change of scenery appeared to restore her equilibrium, and she returned to Manchester seemingly recovered from her temporary breakdown. But recovery was perhaps too strong a word. Eleanor had learned to mask her anxieties, to present a facade of normalcy that satisfied social expectations while indulging her compulsions in private. She continued to maintain her detailed journals, now written in a code of her own devising. She began following Thomas to work, keeping carefully concealed distance while monitoring his activities throughout the day. She hired a series of private investigators to report on his movements when her own surveillance was not possible. What Eleanor discovered through these investigations would have tested the patience of any wife, but it would prove absolutely catastrophic to a woman of her particular psychological makeup. Thomas Hartwell, that pillar of Victorian respectability, was leading a remarkably active secret life. There was Margaret Fielding, the young woman who worked at the lending library on King Street. Thomas had been meeting her twice weekly for more than a year, renting a room above Morrison's bakery for their afternoon encounters. There was Mrs. Catherine Powell, the widow who lived 3 streets over, with whom he spent his Sunday afternoons when Eleanor believed he was visiting his elderly mother. Most shocking of all, there was James Mitchell, a junior clerk at Cromwell and Associates, with whom Thomas had been conducting an intimate relationship for the better part of 2 years. For a woman who had built her entire identity around being the perfect wife, these revelations were devastating beyond measure. Eleanor had devoted 14 years of her life to Thomas's comfort and care, had sacrificed her own desires and ambitions to support his career, had maintained his home like a shrine to their marriage. And all the while, he had been treating their sacred bond as nothing more than a convenient arrangement, a respectable cover for his pursuit of pleasure elsewhere. But Eleanor did not confront Thomas immediately. Instead, she did what she had always done when faced with overwhelming emotion. She planned. For 6 months, she gathered evidence of his infidelities, documenting times, places, and participants with the same methodical precision she had once applied to household management. She learned the schedules of his various lovers, mapped out their meeting places, and began to understand the intricate web of deception Thomas had constructed around their marriage. During this period, those who knew Eleanor noted a change in her demeanor. The nervous energy that had characterized her earlier breakdown was replaced by an unsettling calm. She smiled more frequently, but her smile seemed somehow disconnected from any genuine emotion. She spoke less, but when she did speak, her words carried a weight that made others uncomfortable. Most disturbing of all, she began to show an unusual interest in her husband's physical well-being, constantly fussing over his health, preparing special meals to build up his strength, insisting he maintain a regular exercise routine. Thomas, perhaps guilty about his deceptions, or simply pleased by what seemed like renewed attention from his wife, welcomed Eleanor's increased solicitude. He complimented her cooking, praised her attention to his comfort, and even suggested they might consider taking a holiday together, something they had not done in several years. Eleanor agreed enthusiastically to the holiday proposal, suggesting they spend a week at a cottage in the Lake District she had found, advertised in the Manchester Guardian. The cottage, she explained, was perfectly isolated, surrounded by miles of wilderness, ideal for a couple seeking to renew their connection away from the distractions of city life. Thomas, touched by what he interpreted as his wife's desire to repair their relationship, readily agreed to the arrangement. They departed Manchester on the morning train on November 10th, 1923. Fellow passengers would later recall the couple as pleasant and unremarkable, Eleanor reading quietly while Thomas worked on papers from the office. They appeared, by all accounts, to be exactly what they claimed: a middle-aged married couple taking a well-deserved vacation. The cottage Eleanor had selected stood alone on the shores of Grasmere, a modest stone structure with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room warmed by a large fireplace. The nearest neighbour was more than 2 miles away, and the winding mountain roads meant that visitors were extremely unlikely. It was, as Eleanor had promised, the perfect place for a couple to be alone with each other. For 3 days, they maintained the pretense of a romantic getaway. They took long walks along the lake shore, prepared meals together, and sat by the fireplace in the evenings while Eleanor read aloud from volumes of Wordsworth and Coleridge. Thomas, perhaps moved by the peaceful surroundings and his wife's apparent contentment, began to speak of making changes in his life, of spending more time at home, of the possibility of taking an early retirement so they might enjoy their remaining years together. Eleanor listened to these promises with perfect composure, asking occasional questions about his plans, expressing what seemed like genuine interest in their shared future. But privately, she was making her own preparations. During their afternoon walks, while Thomas admired the scenery, Eleanor was identifying the deepest parts of the lake, noting the locations of abandoned mine shafts, memorizing the patterns of local foot traffic. On the evening of November 13th, Eleanor prepared what she described to Thomas as a celebration dinner. She explained, brought a bottle of very fine wine from Manchester, something special to mark what she hoped would be a new beginning in their marriage. The meal was elaborate by cottage standards. Roast lamb with herbs she had gathered from the hills, potatoes prepared with butter and cream, fresh bread baked that afternoon in the cottage's small oven. Thomas complimented the meal extensively, noting that the wine was perhaps the finest he had ever tasted. Eleanor had, she explained, obtained it from a wine merchant in Manchester who specialized in French imports, something she had been saving for just such an occasion. The wine was indeed exceptional, though Thomas might have been less appreciative had he known that Eleanor had enhanced its flavor with a careful measure of laudanum, obtained during her earlier nervous episode, and carefully preserved for just this moment. As the drug took effect, Thomas found himself increasingly drowsy, attributing his condition to the rich food, the fine wine, and the mountain air. Eleanor suggested they retire early, perhaps to continue their celebration in the privacy of their bedroom. Thomas agreed readily, though he found himself surprisingly unsteady as they climbed the narrow staircase to the cottage's upper floor. He collapsed onto the bed, fully clothed, mumbling apologies for his sudden exhaustion. Eleanor helped him remove his jacket and boots, speaking soothingly about the restorative effects of country air and the importance of proper rest. Within minutes, Thomas was deeply unconscious, his breathing slow and regular, his body completely relaxed. Eleanor waited another hour to ensure the laudanum had taken full effect, then returned downstairs to collect the items she had carefully concealed in her traveling trunk. The butcher's cleaver she had purchased from a shop in Keswick, claiming she needed it to prepare game for their holiday meals. The bone saw had been more difficult to acquire, but a generous payment to a local carpenter had secured the tool along with a promise of discretion. The collection of knives, ropes, and canvas wrapping had been gathered piece by piece during their stay, each purchase made at a different shop, always with a plausible explanation ready for curious merchants. Back in the bedroom, Eleanor began her work with the methodical precision that had characterized her entire approach to this endeavor. She had studied anatomy texts during her months of preparation, learning the location of major arteries, the structure of human joints, the most efficient methods for separating a body into manageable portions. The process took her nearly 8 hours, during which she maintained the same calm focus she had once applied to organizing church socials. Thomas never woke during the dismemberment. The laudanum kept him deeply unconscious, even as Eleanor systematically reduced him from a complete human being to 14 carefully wrapped parcels. She worked by the light of several oil lamps, pausing occasionally to clean her tools, to adjust her position, to ensure that her work met the exacting standards she had set for herself. By dawn, on November 14th, Thomas Hartwell had ceased to exist as anything recognizable as human. In his place lay 14 packages, each wrapped in oiled canvas and secured with rope, each labeled in Eleanor's precise handwriting with a number and a brief description of its contents. She had divided him not randomly, but according to a system she had devised. Head and neck comprised parcels 1 and 2. The torso was separated into 4 sections. Each limb was divided into 2 packages, with hands and feet receiving individual attention. Eleanor spent the remainder of that day cleaning the cottage with the same thoroughness she had once applied to her Manchester home. She scrubbed every surface with lye soap and hot water, burned the blood-stained bedding in the fireplace, and carefully disposed of any evidence that might suggest violence had occurred in the peaceful lakeside retreat. The cottage's isolation, which had seemed so romantic when Thomas was alive, now proved perfectly suited to her more practical purposes. That evening, as dusk settled over Grasmere, Eleanor began the task of distribution. She had planned this phase as carefully as the killing itself, identifying 14 separate locations within a radius of 10 miles where the packages could be concealed. Some went into the deepest parts of the lake, weighted with stones, and sunk in areas where the water was too cold and deep for easy retrieval. Others were buried in remote sections of the surrounding mountains, in locations she had scouted during their scenic walks. The most brazen disposal involved parcel number 1, which contained Thomas's head. Eleanor carried this package back to the cottage they had rented, placing it carefully in the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor. She reasoned that this location was so obvious, so psychologically improbable, that it would be the last place anyone would think to search. On November 15th, Eleanor returned to Manchester alone, informing the station master that her husband had decided to extend his holiday for several additional days of fishing. She appeared composed and rested, commenting to fellow passengers that the mountain air had been wonderfully restorative. Several people who had known the Hartwells for years later remarked that Eleanor seemed more relaxed and content than they had seen her in years. For 3 weeks, Eleanor maintained the fiction that Thomas was still enjoying his holiday in the Lake District. She told neighbors he had written to say the fishing was exceptional, that he was considering purchasing property in the area for future vacations. She even received and responded to several letters addressed to Thomas, forging his handwriting to maintain correspondence with his business associates. The deception might have continued indefinitely if not for Thomas's failure to appear at an important business meeting with representatives from a major textile firm. When Cromwell and Associates attempted to reach him at the Lake District cottage, they discovered that no one named Hartwell was registered there, and that no one matching Thomas's description had been seen in the area for more than a week. Initial investigations focused on the possibility that Thomas had suffered an accident while walking alone in the mountains, or had perhaps fallen into one of the area's many lakes or streams. Search parties combed the hills around Grasmere for several days without finding any trace of the missing man. It was only when investigators began to examine Thomas's personal effects, left behind at the cottage Eleanor claimed he had rented, that suspicions began to shift toward more sinister possibilities. The cottage, when properly searched, revealed traces of blood that Eleanor's cleaning had not entirely eliminated. More significantly, investigators discovered Thomas's personal papers, including his wallet and pocket watch, carefully hidden in a drawer of the cottage's bedroom. No man planning to extend his holiday would have left such essential items behind, and their concealment suggested deliberate deception rather than accidental loss. Eleanor maintained her story under initial questioning, insisting that Thomas must have suffered some form of accident or temporary confusion that prevented him from returning home as planned. She expressed appropriate concern for his welfare, cooperated fully with police inquiries, and even offered a reward for information leading to his safe return. Her performance was so convincing that several investigators initially considered her above suspicion, but Eleanor's psychological makeup, which had enabled her to plan and execute Thomas's murder with such precision, also contained the seeds of her eventual downfall. The same obsessive attention to detail that had made her crime possible also compelled her to revisit the scenes of her work, to ensure that nothing had been overlooked, no evidence left behind that might compromise her carefully constructed alibi. On December 3rd, less than 3 weeks after Thomas's disappearance, Eleanor returned to the Lake District under the pretense of assisting with the search efforts. She claimed she wanted to explore areas where Thomas might have wandered, to provide any insights that might help locate her missing husband. Local constables, impressed by her dedication and apparent distress, readily agreed to her request. What they did not know was that Eleanor was actually checking on the locations where she had disposed of Thomas's remains. The winter weather had been severe, with heavy rains that might have disturbed her burial sites, and fluctuating lake levels that could potentially expose the packages she had sunk in the deeper waters. Her compulsive need for control demanded that she verify the security of each disposal site. It was this return journey that provided investigators with their first concrete evidence of Eleanor's guilt. A local shepherd, who had been questioned during the initial search efforts, reported seeing a woman matching Eleanor's description in a remote area of the mountains on the night of November 14th, carrying what appeared to be a heavy bundle. At the time, he had thought nothing of the encounter, assuming the woman was simply moving supplies or personal belongings. But when Eleanor appeared in the same area 3 weeks later, claiming she had never been there before, the shepherd's memory was jogged. He approached the constables accompanying Eleanor and mentioned his earlier sighting, innocently asking if she recalled their brief encounter near the old mine workings. Eleanor's reaction, a moment of panic quickly suppressed, was enough to convince the investigating officers that they needed to examine her story more closely. A more thorough search of the cottage where the Hartwells had stayed revealed additional evidence that Eleanor's cleaning had missed. Traces of laudanum were found in a wine bottle, along with microscopic fragments of bone and tissue that laboratory analysis would later confirm as human remains. Most damaging of all, investigators discovered Eleanor's detailed journals, hidden in a secret compartment of her traveling trunk. The journals provided a complete record of Eleanor's surveillance activities, her discovery of Thomas's infidelities, and her methodical planning for his murder. Written in the coded language she had developed years earlier, they detailed her acquisition of tools, her study of human anatomy, and her selection of disposal sites. Most chilling of all were the entries describing her emotional state during the planning phase, entries that revealed not rage or despair, but a cold satisfaction in the elegance of her solution to the problem Thomas represented. Eleanor was arrested on December 8, 1923, charged with the willful murder of her husband. The case immediately became a sensation in the British press, not merely because of the gruesome nature of the crime, but because of the stark contrast between Eleanor's respectable appearance and the calculated brutality of her actions. Newspaper accounts struggled to reconcile the image of the dutiful Victorian wife with that of a woman capable of systematically dismembering her husband's body. The trial, which began on March 15, 1924, attracted enormous public attention. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators, eager to observe this most unusual defendant, this woman who had apparently maintained perfect composure while reducing her husband to 14 parcels of human remains. Eleanor's demeanor throughout the proceedings was remarkably consistent with her public persona, quiet, dignified, and seemingly puzzled by the attention her case was receiving. Her defense attorney attempted to argue temporary insanity, claiming that the shock of discovering Thomas's infidelities had temporarily unbalanced Eleanor's mind, leading her to commit acts completely inconsistent with her character and upbringing. He pointed to her earlier nervous episode as evidence of underlying mental instability, suggesting that the stress of maintaining her marriage to an unfaithful husband had gradually eroded her psychological defenses. But the prosecution, led by Sir Reginald Morrison, painted a very different picture of Eleanor Hartwell. Using her own journals as evidence, he demonstrated that Thomas's murder had been planned with careful deliberation over a period of months. He argued that Eleanor's actions showed not the impulsive violence of temporary madness, but the calculated cruelty of someone who had carefully weighed her options and chosen murder as the most satisfying solution to her marital problems. The most damaging evidence came from Eleanor's own words, as recorded in her coded journals. The prosecution presented translations of entries that revealed her growing excitement as she planned Thomas's death, her satisfaction in contemplating his final moments of unconsciousness, and her sense of accomplishment as she methodically dismembered his body. These were not the thoughts of a temporarily deranged woman, Morrison argued, but the reflections of someone who had found genuine pleasure in the act of murder. Perhaps most disturbing were the journal entries describing Eleanor's emotional state in the weeks following Thomas's death. Rather than expressing guilt or remorse, she wrote about feeling liberated, finally free from the burden of maintaining her marriage to a man who had never appreciated her devotion. She described a sense of completion, as if the murder had fulfilled some deep psychological need that years of conventional marriage had left unsatisfied. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty. Eleanor received the sentence with the same composure she had maintained throughout the trial, offering only a brief statement in which she expressed regret for any pain her actions had caused to Thomas's family and friends. She made no mention of Thomas himself, nor did she acknowledge any wrongdoing in her treatment of him. Eleanor Hartwell was executed by hanging on June 12, 1924, exactly 34 years to the day after her wedding to Thomas. Her final words, according to the prison chaplain, were not an expression of remorse or a prayer for forgiveness, but a request that someone tend to the rose garden she had maintained at their Manchester home. Even facing death, her thoughts remained focused on the details of domestic management that had defined her life. The Hartwell case sent shockwaves through British society, challenging comfortable assumptions about feminine nature and the stability of middle-class marriage. Eleanor's crime was particularly disturbing because it could not be easily explained away as the product of obvious mental illness or extreme provocation. She had killed not in a moment of passion, but as the result of careful planning and cool determination. More troubling still was the implication that Eleanor's obsessive devotion to her marriage, far from being admirable, had been a warning sign of dangerous psychological instability. The very qualities that Victorian society prized in women, selfless dedication to their husband's welfare, meticulous attention to domestic details, complete subordination of personal desires to family needs, had, in Eleanor's case, become the foundation for calculated murder. The search for Thomas Hartwell's remains continued for several years after Eleanor's execution, but only 7 of the 14 packages were ever recovered. The others, hidden in locations Eleanor took to her grave, remained concealed somewhere in the Lake District, silent testament to one woman's methodical approach to marital disappointment. Visitors to the area occasionally report finding mysterious bundles buried in remote locations, but forensic examination has never confirmed these discoveries as related to the Hartwell case. The cottage where Eleanor committed her crime stood empty for nearly a decade after the trial, local residents being reluctant to occupy a place where such calculated violence had occurred. When it was finally rented again, tenants reported strange sounds in the night, the sensation of being watched by invisible eyes, and a persistent odor that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the building. These reports were likely products of imagination rather than supernatural intervention, but they spoke to the lasting psychological impact of Eleanor's methodical brutality. Eleanor Hartwell's case remains one of the most psychologically complex crimes in British legal history, a reminder that the capacity for calculated violence can exist behind the most respectable facades, nurtured by the very social expectations that are meant to constrain destructive impulses. Her crime was not a crime of passion, but of precision, carried out by a woman who had learned to channel her deepest frustrations into a plan of remarkable, terrible efficiency. In the end, Eleanor achieved exactly what she had set out to accomplish. She had removed Thomas from her life completely, ensuring that he would never again disappoint her expectations or betray her trust. That this solution required his murder and dismemberment was, from her perspective, simply a practical consideration, no different from any other domestic challenge that required careful planning and methodical execution. The 14 pieces of Thomas Hartwell, scattered across the Lake District landscape, stand as a monument to the dangerous potential that lies dormant within apparently ordinary lives, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to transform devotion into destruction, love into something far more deadly than hate.